The trial of one of the most influential figures in Australian media history began this week when Alan Jones walked into a Sydney courtroom facing 6 complainants, 22 charges and a trial that could span several months. It comes after years of pre-trial fighting and multiple rounds of charges being dropped. Today, we are going to explain everything you need to know about this veteran broadcaster and how we got here.
So, Em, we covered Alan Jones now over a year ago on this podcast when charges were laid against him as far back as November 2024.
Yep.
I want to start with a really clear understanding of who Alan Jones is, because I think for younger listeners especially, but also people at all different parts of their media consumption life, they might not know the kind of radio giant that Alan Jones was. Give me a sense of the man.
Yeah, so Alan Jones is now an 85-year-old retired broadcaster, but he spent decades at the top of Australia's media industry. He is considered one of the most powerful media figures of his time. Most of that power was centered around his radio broadcasting career. So he started broadcasting in 1985, first at the Sydney station 2UE before he moved to 2GB. They are AM talkback juggernauts. And it was at 2GB where Jones really became this ratings king via his breakfast radio show, his talkback show.
I do think it's worth mentioning, it's a bit meta of us, but in the kind of pre-podcast era, you know, the weight of morning radio, talkback radio was massive.
Exactly.
It was a hugely influential position in the country.
And it is still a hugely consumed medium. AM radio ratings are still enormous.
Yeah.
There is massive commercial revenue to be made from these programs, but certainly pre-podcasting, pre the digital age, this was a very different time when Alan Jones came up. Now, he retired from 2GB in May 2020. He did continue on with his own Sky News show until 2021, and until recently has also had regular opinion columns in News Corp newspapers. So he's been around for many, many decades. Before he pivoted to a media career, though, I think it is worth noting he had a foot in politics. He actually unsuccessfully ran for politics himself via the now defunct Country Party and the Liberals. He was the speechwriter of the former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser in the late 70s and early 80s. And he coached the Wallabies in the mid-1980s. So before or during his political tilt, he was also this prominent figure in the sporting world. Even earlier than that, he was an English teacher. He was a rugby coach at some prominent private schools across the country. So a very kind of distinct figure across different pillars of Australian life in the late 20th century.
So those different media forms that you've mentioned there, TV, radio, print, they're all part of the broader kind of conservative landscape in Australian media. Would it be fair to say that he would be categorised by most as a conservative commentator? Is that the right way to kind of describe him?
Absolutely. I think that's a very fair description, given that he had his own political ambitions in the Liberal Party, that he worked for a Liberal PM as a senior advisor and speechwriter, but he really was well known as this outspoken conservative commentator, a very divisive voice who was, you know, no stranger to grilling politicians, leaders here and abroad. And some of his most controversial moments really came from these national talking point, hot button topics that I'll take you through. And this might be how some listeners kind of first heard of Alan Jones.
Sure.
So just to pick a handful, let's take it back to 2005. This is days ahead of the Cronulla riots erupting in Sydney, when at the time Jones on air encouraged bikie gangs to descend on Cronulla train station in numbers when, quote, these Lebanese thugs arrive. Jones said, the bikie gangs have been much maligned, but they do a lot of good things.
Right.
That drew a lot of hate. In 2012, one of his most divisive or controversial moments came when, after the Prime Minister Julia Gillard's father had died, he was recorded giving an address to the young Liberals at the University of Sydney. This is what he said in that moment.
Every person in the caucus of the Labor Party knows that Julia Gillard's a liar. Everybody. I'll cover that in a moment. The old man must be died and he was going, shame. You think that he had a daughter and told lies to become she was a parliament.
Now, it's a little bit hard to hear what he was saying then, but to recap, he called Julia Gillard a liar. He said Her old man recently died a few weeks ago of shame to think he had a daughter who told lies every time she stood Parliament. There was massive backlash over those comments. That came to a head with an apology press conference of sorts. Jones said, "I owe her an apology. I hope I'll be able to make that to her, not to her through you," speaking to the media. But he largely used that opportunity as a moment to really question the ethics of the reporter who recorded him at UCID rather than to kind of deal with the substance of his comments. And then most recently, one of his most controversial moments in 2019 came when he told Prime Minister Scott Morrison to, quote, "shove a sock down her throat," speaking about the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern.
Hi there, I'm Abigail, or Av for short. I'm TDA's video producer, which means I do a lot of the jazzy video edits that you see on Instagram and TikTok. But from time to time, I'll be on camera reporting on the latest stories in science, thanks to my background in medical science. TDA is always trying to grow and grow, so I just have one tiny request. We need you to hit follow or subscribe wherever you're listening or watching this podcast. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, just go to our podcast show page and the button will be there at the top. And if you're watching on YouTube, press subscribe. And thank you for being a part of the TDA community.
So you mentioned before that Alan Jones retired in early 2020, still had a couple of TV appearances and print appearances, but his main format of radio, that came to an end in a couple of years ago now, at the start of the pandemic. Now he's on trial. How did we get here?
So this one stretches over more than an 18-month period. You mentioned at the start of the episode that we did chat about these allegations way back in November 2024. That is when Alan Jones was first arrested, and that followed an 8-month investigation into these major allegations that had been raised by the Sydney Morning Herald. So that was a huge investigation by that newspaper at the time that then triggered a New South Wales police investigation. At the point of his arrest, Jones was charged with 24 alleged sexual offences relating to 8 complainants, so 8 alleged victim survivors.
Right.
A month later, by the time he pled not guilty in December 2024, those offences had climbed to 34 charges involving 10 complainants. Now, since then, the case has changed shape several times. A judge put it in terms of that this case has been reformed multiple times, and that's because a lot of charges have been dropped. But Jones is currently on trial in Sydney's Downing Centre local court on 22 charges, 20 counts of indecent assault and 2 counts of sexual touching without consent.
Talk me through that point you raised around charges being dropped. So we know that this is a complex area of law where you're dealing with, a huge amount of very difficult factors around memory and evidence, whether people want to come forward or not, and especially in a high-profile situation like this, it can be, a massive burden on alleged victims. Why have there been charges dropped here?
I mean, a lot of it is speculation. Some of this information we'll never really know.
Right.
These allegations relate to alleged offences between 2003 and 2020. So we're talking about decades worth of incidents, and for many, many reasons it can be super complicated to prosecute historic allegations. But in one earlier stage, 11 counts of indecent assault were replaced with lesser charges, and that meant that 2 of the complainants dropped out of the case altogether.
Right.
That change also meant that Jones would face a judge alone in a local court rather than a jury trial at a higher court. And that was a huge argument put forward by Jones' defense team, that they were really seeking to avoid a jury trial. They had argued that because of the high-profile nature of their client and this case, that really there was not going to be an option or an opportunity for a fair trial by jury. In June this year, prosecutors withdrew a single charge relating to another complainant, and most recently in July, 4 more charges were dropped. Back to the question of why, Jones's defense team told the court that it was the Director of Public Prosecutions themselves that determined there should be no further proceedings on those complainants.
Right.
We don't have specific reasoning, but oftentimes that is due to a lack of evidence. The DPP will analyse charges and they'll say, obviously in much more complex and rigorous terms, but basically they'll say, do we have enough evidence for this to stand trial? What will it be for the alleged victim to go through those proceedings? Will it be worth it? Is the outcome worth it, basically? Is it worth the court's time and money to put this to a trial?
But despite all of that, I mean, there are still 22 counts of indecent assault and sexual touching without consent that Jones is now facing. Explain these charges in a little more detail for me.
So those 22 charges relate to 6 alleged victims. That's down from the original 10 in December 2024. Now, all of those alleged victims claim Jones indecently assaulted or sexually touched them between 2003 and 2020.
So there's still that 17-year window.
Exactly, a long window of time at various locations across both Sydney and the New South Wales Southern Highlands region.
Right.
So the region around Bowral, for listeners who may not be familiar with New South Wales. None of those complainants, though, can be identified for legal reasons.
Sure.
So we don't know who they are, but prosecutors claim Jones targeted, quote, significantly younger men. They say some he knew professionally, some he'd only just met, and that the alleged offences of indecent assault and sexual touching occurred at his apartment in Circular Quay in Sydney, at his farm in Fitzroy Falls, in his workplace, in lifts, in cars, and even in public at a fundraising event and a restaurant in Sydney. The specific allegations include unwanted touching of complainants' genitals and kissing them without consent.
And how has Jones responded to these charges?
He has pled not guilty.
To all of them?
To all of them.
Right.
He has maintained his innocence the entire time. So since his first arrest in November 2024. When he was arrested, his lawyers told the media nothing has been tested, nothing has been proven. Alan Jones will assert his innocence appropriately in the courtroom. And then Alan Jones broke his silence on all of this in December 2024 when he said he never indecently assaulted these people. To quote Jones, he said, "These allegations are all either baseless or they distort the truth." Since then, it's been over a year of these pre-trial legal arguments. And the length of time has really been extended or influenced by the changes in this case, the dropping of charges, the assessment of evidence. Jones's team has also argued over what evidence can be used, over how the trial can be reported, search warrants. It's been very complicated.
So now, though, we're here. The trial is happening this week. Do you know what's happening in the actual courtroom itself? I mean, my first question is media allowed in the courtroom for this trial?
Yes. So we do have journalists in the courtroom.
Right. Because there are some cases where, for various reasons, be it the nature of the crime or the nature of the alleged perpetrator, there is actually a closed courtroom.
And some of these proceedings will be closed.
Right.
So certain testimony from the complainants will be private, will be behind closed doors. Media won't be reporting on what's said for some witnesses.
Right.
But broadly speaking, yes, this is going to be a very publicly reported on trial.
With no jury, right?
With no jury. And so what that means is it's up to a judge, in this case, Judge Glenn Walsh, to decide the ruling and sentencing if there is a conviction, of course, determining whether or not that threshold of if these charges have been proved beyond reasonable doubt, the highest legal threshold there is. The trial length is anyone's guess. It could take several weeks. It could take up to 4 months. That's because the court is going to hear from about 76 witnesses.
Wow, that's a lot. That's, I mean, especially in the local court environment, that's a huge witness list.
Yeah, very, very long. And so far we have only heard from the prosecutor. So the Crown prosecutor, Georgina Wright, gave her opening address on Monday, and she used that address to outline the allegations against Jones by each complainant, alleged victim to alleged victim. And as I said, these are anonymous complainants, and there's not a lot that we've known about the detail behind their allegations until this week when we learnt a little bit more. One complainant, described by Wright as a promising young sports champion, met Jones when he was approximately 16 years old. He alleges that Alan Jones gave him a phone, gave him a car, told him he loved him, and began paying him a weekly allowance so that he could, quote, focus on his future. That was $400 a week, later increased to $600 a week because, to quote the prosecutor, Jones said that he had been such a good boy. Wright told the court that that man, quote, felt trapped and didn't know what to do. A second complainant was 21 at the time of the alleged incident. He was working for Alan Jones and alleges he was called Darling and groped while driving in a car by Jones in front of colleagues. One colleague allegedly noticed this person's discomfort. Other colleagues joked about it, laughed about it. There's another complainant who is an unnamed swimmer who will allege Jones called him handsome, a superstar, told him, quote, "You're special," and kissed him at an awards ceremony and later sent him a text reading, "Great to see you. You look great. I love you." Two further complainants, and this is quite an important one, alleged they were indecently assaulted both at the age of 17. So that's where some of the underage allegations come in. So that is what we heard from the Crown prosecutor, Georgina Wright. Now, similarly, we heard opening remarks from Alan Jones' legal side. His barrister, Gabrielle Bashir, argued in court on Monday, quote, "Rivalry, treachery, double dealing, money, hatred, desperation, opportunism, and more are at the heart of this case." That was during her opening remarks on Monday. So you can really see there a bit of a glimpse into how the defense are going to position their argument, dismissing, in their words, these alleged victims or complainants as coming after some kind of clout or money or fame or whatever it might be.
And I just want to end by getting you to chat a little bit more about this media aspect and the reporting aspect. I'm sure we're going to be talking about this case a lot over the next weeks or months in the TDA newsroom. How can media report on this trial?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one. And in any high-profile case like this, of course, the defense's lawyers have the right to ask for a closed proceeding.
Yeah.
You know, this is not America. We don't typically live stream proceedings.
Or the prosecution's lawyers if they believe it's in the best interests of the alleged victims as well.
Exactly. And more we're hearing discussion and thoughtful conversation about what it means for alleged victims to go through these criminal proceedings. Alan Jones' lawyers did argue that because the evidence, or at least some of the evidence, was going to be heard in private hearings, that media outlets shouldn't be allowed to report on it. The ABC, the Sydney Morning Herald, and a few other outlets argued against that, and ultimately the judge in this case sided with the media. They ruled that outlets can report on the complainant's evidence as the trial goes on.
Right.
But, you know, it's a case-by-case basis. It may have been a different story if this was a jury trial.
Sure.
There's so much more concern over media reporting and coverage and protecting a jury when a case is this high profile, but it will be up to the judge to make their own determinations regardless of the conversation that goes on in the media. But all of that, I guess, is to say, Sam, that this is going to be unfolding for a little while to come.
Yeah.
I'm sure there will be some compelling witness testimony that will be reported on, and we'll keep an eye on it.
And then I'm sure at some stage we might hear from Jones himself taking the stand too. I have no doubt that we'll be covering this again on the podcast as it develops. One of the biggest media personalities of the last couple of decades in Australia now facing some very serious allegations. Em, thank you for taking us through that. Now, a bit of a lighter note to end. Do you have a tidbit for us?
I do have a tidbit. I
That's
have
good.
a quick, short, sharp, very happy tidbit, a good piece of news to share. Sam, I know you were fighting the good fight for Miles Phillips.
I was.
The
Oh,
7-year-old behind the pop phenomenon Eastern Rosellas.
Yeah. I saw a Western Rosella the other week and went up and just reassured the Western Rosella that we haven't forgotten.
I know. You
Yeah.
got to think of the other Rosellas in these moments. I did say to a few people that the Crimson Rosella must really be feeling like the Antonia Kidman of the family.
Totally. But they had a good early 2000s with some spectacular sweaters. So I think,
100%.
But talk to me about the Eastern Rosellas.
Okay, so this is about Miles Phillips,
Yep.
the 7-year-old. He has officially entered the ARIA charts.
Wow.
Debuted at number 5.
Wow.
The ARIA Top 20 Singles chart. There he is,
Unbelievable.
number 5, 1 week in. I mean, this is something that artists wait their whole lives for.
It's the best of the internet on display in an evolving story.
Yeah, I think it's incredible. I think at 7 years old that Miles Phillips may be the youngest Aussie to ever chart.
Wow.
The Kid Laroi is the youngest Aussie to ever reach number 1. He did that when he was 17 in 2021. But I'm pretty sure 7 years old number 5 has got to be a record.
I reckon it could get there.
I have reached out to the good people at ARIA to confirm my suspicions. And when we have a primary source, course, as we do at the Daily Oz, I will confirm that for you 100%. But come on, 7 years old, number 5. I think we need to get him at least in the top 5 of the hottest 100 this year.
Unreal. Look at the beautiful colours is all I have to say.
And I feed them seeds that they like to eat.
Oh, yes. Love it.
They're flying over my head now.
That's all we've got for you on today's episode of The Daily Oz. We'll be back this afternoon with your headlines. Until then, have a beautiful day.